Hello, my name is Jon Hoover. I'm Associate Professor of Islamic Studies at the University of Nottingham, and I'm pleased to introduce my book, Ibn Taymiyya, published by One World Academic in London in their Makers of the Muslim World series in 2019. I wrote this book because I was asked to write it by one of the editors of the series, Makers of the Muslim World. So this is a series of books on all sorts of different figures who are considered important figures in the Muslim world. And I wrote it because I'd been working with Ibn Taymiyya in various respects for more than 15 years. And the introduction to his life and thought that was the most academic was written in 1939 in French. And so I really felt the need for something new. There'd been so much interesting scholarship put out in the meantime, particularly since the 1990s. And it really seemed like it was time for a new synthesis. So the foremost argument I'm trying to make in this book, the primary argument, is that Ibn Taymiyya is focused on worshiping God. His argument, his apologetic argument for Islam, is that it's focused on worshiping God alone, and to do that correctly, you need to worship God according to God's law and reject all innovations. So I'm arguing that this is something that he believes God is working toward, and that we human beings should be working toward as well. And he, as I show in the book, he worked at it through his life, through a life of activism, through his ethics, through his jurisprudence, and also even his theology. And so one of the key things I wanted to show in the book is how his view of God as a figure who is working toward the best for humankind is works together in a kind of utilitarian ethics with human beings who are supposed to adopt the same approach. So let me spell that out a little bit differently, if I may. Ibn Taymiyya is focused on the law, yes, but he also believes that the law of God is the most beneficial to humankind. And tied in with that is that the theology he advocates and that he explains is the most reasonable. So benefit and reason go together. And his whole theology and ethics is a kind of apology for the revealed law. And within that revealed law, you also have things you're supposed to believe about God, and that gets into theology. So it all works together into what he believes is something revealed and something that is natural, beneficial to humankind, and perfectly reasonable. So he's trying to bring all that together into a coherent whole, and I'm trying to show that in the book. So I've structured the book into basically three parts. The first two chapters deal with Ibn Taymiyya's life, his activism. The first chapter takes us from his birth in 1263 up to about 1303, and that's when there were Mongol invasions from 1299 to 1303, which he was really important in advocating against. So he lived in Syria, and Damascus was his home, and the Mongols were invading from the northeast. And so he was advocating for his rulers, the Mamluks, to fight the Mongols and resist them because he simply didn't like Syria being invaded. So he had both political and religious aims, we might say, in his resistance. So that takes us up to about the age of 40. So roughly speaking, chapters 1 up to the age of 40, and chapter 2 is then from 40 to 65 in the solar calendar, solar years, and 67 in lunar years. In the latter part of his life. In the latter part of his life, he spent 7 years in Cairo, was taken there first due to a number of trials over his theological doctrine, and then he was imprisoned in Cairo, and then he got out. He's active teaching. He also went to Alexandria. Eventually, he went back to Syria in 1313, and he spent the rest of his life there, and eventually died in prison. So I recount all of that. I'm trying to do two things within these two chapters. One is to show how his life of activism fits in with his theology overall and his theological ethics. And two, I'm trying to date his writings, at least his major writings, as best I can, because there's quite a difficulty in Taymiyyan studies. We don't have a good sense of of the order of his writings, but I try to get the dates down for some of the most important. Then we go into chapter 3, which is the most important in the book. It begins the second major section of the book on his ethics and jurisprudence. And chapter 3 outlines what I mentioned earlier about his making worship priority. So he talks about two principles, one of which is that we worship God alone, no other gods, and that we worship God according to God's law and avoiding innovation. So chapter 3 spells that out. Chapter 4 elaborates particularly what Ibn Taymiyya means by law, and it's a very all-encompassing concept. It's not just a what we might think of a law promulgated by a modern government today. It includes ethics, includes worship rituals, includes all aspects of life. And then there's some stuff in chapter 4 about innovations which Ibn Taymiyya dislikes, for example, celebrating the Prophet's birthday. And then at the end of the chapter 4, I talk about Ibn Taymiyya's relationship to Sufism, which is a controversial topic, and I try to show what he thinks about that. Then we move into chapter 5, where I look specifically at Ibn Taymiyya's thinking about how we derive the law. He's famous, of course, for wanting the Muslim community to go back to the Quran and the Sunnah, back to the Salaf, the early generations of Islam, as the primary authoritative example which Muslims should follow. And I give two examples in there of how his legal thinking works. One is his prohibition of chess, and second example is his invalidation of triple divorce, for which he's well known, and which some modern Muslim states have used actually to outlaw triple divorce. The 6th chapter then looks at his social ethics, his political ethics, and here I focus quite a bit on the utilitarian aspects of Ibn Taymiyya's thinking. So a couple of different ways you can look at Ibn Taymiyya's utilitarianism, and I call it a religious utilitarianism to distinguish it from the modern utilitarianism of Bentham and Stuart Mill, John Stuart Mill. This sometimes is controversial, but what I mean by religious utilitarianism is not happiness for the greatest number, the most happiness for the greatest number in a modern and secular sense, but rather the most religious benefit for the most people. And that's what God is seeking. God wants everybody to be worshiping God alone. And of course, we as human beings in our obedience to God should be doing the same thing. And so you have the most beneficial path, which is to follow the Sharia or the law of God exactly. But human beings being weak and being in the fact we're in a world that's less than ideal in some sense, we can't always do exactly what God would want. Ibn Taymiyya recognizes that. He takes the example of the caliphate. So in his view, the first 4 caliphs, the Rashidun, are the ideal period, but then we have a decline into what he calls mulk or kingship, and you still have caliphs, but they aren't the ideal caliph. So what do we do? Ibn Taymiyya says we've got to weigh up the benefits and the harms. And rulers may not be able to promote the law of God in every respect. That is their job, by the way, is to promote the law of God as far as they can, as far as possible. So he says rulers and, in fact, all human beings need to weigh up the benefits and the detriments, the benefits and the harms of our actions to attain as much as we can with respect to promoting religion, promoting the worship of God correctly. So in this chapter, I look at things like commanding the right, prohibiting the wrong, the caliphate, and also his teaching on jihad, and his, I give an outline of his well-known book, Siyasa Shar'iyya, which is translated Law-Guided Public Policy. Then, so that's the second part of the book. The third and last part of the book is focuses on Ibn Taymiyya's theology. And in some sense, it's a continuation of the second part of the book insofar as his theology is an attempt to articulate what he believes the law teaches us that we have to believe about God. So that said, this last 2 chapters, 7 and 8, do deal with theology in the sense of what is God's relationship to the world spatially, where is God, how do we talk about God, and also the relationship between God and time and God's creation of this world. Then in the last chapter, I look specifically at theology relating to God's relationship to humanity. So here you have the problem of God's justice and the problem of evil, then prophecy as an attempt of God to tell us how to live and how to live rightly. And then there's a question of how that relates to reason. Of course, these questions are very fascinating. And then how we tell the prophet is a true prophet or not. And then I have a short section on Christianity as in Ibn Taymiyya's view, a deviated or a wayward religion, innovated religion. And then finally, at the end of chapter 8, I look at Ibn Taymiyya's view on our final human destiny. And I talk about the fact that he gives arguments for universal salvation, which means the salvation ultimately of not just Muslims, but all humanity. And I show how this fits in with his wider theology of worship. So if God's purpose in creating us human beings, creating the whole creation, in fact, is to bring everybody and everything to worship God in the end, and that's the fullest benefit for all of creation, and that's God's purpose in creating and God's purpose in commanding, then it follows naturally that in the end, after many people spent long periods of time in hell, there'll be a final escape from hell, because what's the final purpose of human beings? It's to worship God alone. And so that's what God is working toward, we might say. The final bit in the book is an epilogue where I look at, very briefly, different ways that Ibn Taymiyya has been appropriated. And I make the point here that he's been used selectively from his own time down to the present. So there are very few Muslims who have taken Ibn Taymiyya as a whole and said, we're going to follow this, but rather they've chosen aspects of his thinking and adopted those and left other things which they're a little bit nervous about. For example, the whole business of universal salvation is an example of something that is still very controversial. Currently, I'm working on the period when Ibn Taymiyya first went to Egypt in 1306 and then to 1307. He was in prison for about 18 months, and he wrote a major work then, and around the question of God's relationship to space. I recently published an article on this, and I'm working more on this under the rubric of Ibn Taymiyya and the problem of corporealism. This is divine corporealism, because he's been accused of corporealism, and yet there are people who say he's not guilty of holding to that doctrine. And this was a question not just today, but in his own time. And there's a lot of interesting events that happened in that very short period of time. And also his writing, his thinking, his actions are really quite fascinating. And I'm investigating that for a larger project.